You're not lazy. You're just afraid of what you'll find if you stop distracting yourself. You say you're procrastinating, that you can't focus, that something's wrong with your discipline. But what if discipline isn't the issue at all? What if the real reason you can't move forward is because moving forward would mean meeting yourself? Not the version you show others, not the image you've been trying to fix, but the part of you that collapsed silently a long time ago and was never buried. Just hidden, behind effort, behind exhaustion, behind tomorrow. You think you're tired because you worked too hard, but the truth, you've been running in circles inside your own mind just to avoid one moment of stillness, because in stillness, the truth speaks, and it says, you're not who you thought you'd be. You've failed in ways you can't admit. You've lost pieces of yourself you don't even remember losing. So you keep moving, or you freeze, but you don't stop. Because stopping would be dangerous. It would mean turning on the light in the room you locked years ago and seeing what's lying on the floor. There's a routine now, one that protects you from collapse by slowly bleeding you instead. You wake up, numb, you scroll, escape, you delay what matters and call it being tired. But tired isn't the problem. The problem is what's underneath the tiredness. A sense that you don't matter unless you're achieving something. A terror that even if you try, you'll still be the same broken thing underneath the effort. Carl Jung said, what you most need to find will be found where you least want to look. And maybe that's exactly where you are now, on the edge of looking. So before we go deeper, ask yourself one thing. What if what you call laziness is actually a muffled scream from the version of you you've been too afraid to face? That's where we begin. You think you're lazy because your body doesn't move. But what if stillness is actually the only thing keeping you from collapse? This isn't about willpower or energy. This is about survival. Not in the physical sense, but in the emotional sense. Your body resists not because it's weak, but because it knows. It knows that action might wake the pain you've tried to bury. There's a difference between being tired and being paralyzed. And most of the time, you're not tired. You're scared. Scared that if you try, really try, you'll confirm your worst fear, that even your best won't be enough. So you pause. Not because you want to, but because you have to. Because the part of you that still remembers the last fall is screaming, don't do it again. Don't open that door. Don't let them see how fragile you really are. Laziness, that's not what this is. This is self-preservation, dressed in silence. It's the soul curling inward, like a wounded animal, too bruised to move. Not because it gave up, but because it's bleeding where no one can see. Every task you delay is not a task avoided. It's a mirror avoided. Because with every attempt comes the memory of failure, of judgment, of shame, of that echo in your head that says, you'll mess it up again, so you retreat. You build walls of distraction, rituals of delay, but deep down, you know it's not the task that scares you. It's the feeling that comes after, that moment when you've done everything right and still feel wrong. And so the body slows, not out of laziness, but out of protection. Because it's easier to hate yourself for being lazy than to admit you're still bleeding from a wound no one ever saw. This isn't weakness, it's armor. And maybe, for now, it's the only thing keeping you from shattering. You're not lazy, you're loyal to an image of yourself that never healed. There's a part of you still trapped in the last time you failed. It remembers the shame, the silence, the way your own thoughts turned against you. Not just disappointment, but the echo that followed it. You see, this is who you really are. So now you hesitate before you even begin. Because you've rehearsed this story so many times, you already know the ending. You already know the feeling of doing everything right and still hearing the voice say, not enough, never enough. That voice didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped by a parent, a teacher, a friend who walked away, by the 1,000 quiet rejections that taught you. Effort means pain, desire means disappointment, hope means humiliation. Now, every time you try, there's a part of you that interrupts, not to stop you from failing, but to stop you from feeling that failure again. You say you want to succeed, but deeper than that, you want to stop being the person who always ruins it. And the irony, that very fear makes you ruin it before you can even start. You live inside a theater of memory, and in every act, you play the same role, the one who falls short, the one who was never truly seen, the one who carries guilt like a second skin, the Galatea effect inverted. When you expect yourself to fail, your body, your choices, even your silences start to conspire in favor of that prophecy. Not because you want to, but because being right about your failure hurts less than hoping again. So no, you're not procrastinating because you're undisciplined. You're procrastinating because you've never forgiven yourself, not for the things you did, but for not becoming the person you promised yourself you'd be. And what if your so-called laziness is just loyalty to the failure you think you deserve? You think it's about the task. You think it's about planning or setting the right goals. But beneath every plan is a memory, a moment your body never forgot. The mind doesn't just remember events, it remembers how they felt, the humiliation, the pressure, the way your heart raced, not from excitement, but from fear of being seen and judged. This is why you freeze, not because you're unmotivated, but because your nervous system is trained to expect pain from effort. You try to move forward, but your subconscious pulls you back to that classroom, that living room, that moment when your vulnerability was met with silence or shame. You associate action with exposure, with being compared, with hearing that old voice again. Who do you think you are? You won't make it. You'll embarrass yourself. So you hesitate. You distract yourself, not because you don't care, but because your body is protecting you from a pain it never processed. Procrastination isn't laziness. It's a trauma response disguised as indecision. You'd learn to avoid not just what's hard, but what's meaningful, because what's meaningful carries the most risk of failure, of disappointment, of confirming that deep, buried belief, I'm not enough. So what do you do instead? You numb, you overthink, you pretend you'll start tomorrow. But the fear isn't of doing the thing. It's of feeling what might come after. That moment of silence, when there's no more effort to hide behind, and all that's left is your reflection. Before your next decision, pause. Not to think, but to feel. Not what you have to do, but what you're afraid will happen inside you when you do it. That's where the real paralysis begins. There's a kind of exhaustion that looks like success, the kind that keeps you busy, keeps you moving, but only in circles. You wake up, you do the things, you check the boxes. And from the outside, you seem functional, maybe even impressive, but inside you're empty. And that emptiness grows quieter the more you perform. This is the new mask, not one of apathy, but of hyperfunction, of staying so occupied that you never have to sit with what's breaking beneath. You're not still, but you're not alive either. You're maintaining, surviving, running a routine that looks like purpose, but feels like silence. There's a moment, though, maybe at night, maybe right before sleep, when it hits, that whisper in the back of your mind. If I stopped everything, would anything in me still be real? And that's where the truth hides. Because sometimes what you call productivity is just a way to delay collapse, a way to postpone that moment when the mask falls and you see what's left underneath. Jung once said, "What you do not make conscious will appear in your life as fate." And maybe that's exactly what this is. Not fate, but avoidance masquerading as destiny. You think laziness is your enemy, but maybe it's the only moment your mind lets go, the only moment your body says, I can't pretend today. And for once, you hear the truth. Not the voice that says do more, but the one that asks, why do you feel like you disappear when you stop moving? Because maybe your so-called laziness isn't a flaw. Maybe it's the only honest thing left in a life that got too good at performing. There's a moment when even effort begins to feel absurd. Not because you're incapable, but because deep down, something in you has stopped believing it matters. It's not fatigue, it's disbelief. Disbelief that anything you do will change the way you feel inside. Disbelief that any goal, any dream, any version of success could reach the part of you that quietly died years ago. This is the deeper silence beneath procrastination. It's not about resisting tasks. It's about mourning the self you thought you'd become, mourning the hunger you used to have for life, and realizing that somewhere along the way, you stopped believing in your own transformation. It's a kind of internal death, one you never speak of, because how do you explain to someone that you're not tired? You're just unconvinced. Unconvinced that trying again will lead anywhere new. Unconvinced that healing will ever reach you. Unconvinced that even if you build the life you once dreamed of, you'll feel worthy enough to live inside it. So you pause, you drift, you disappear into distractions. Not because you don't care, but because the part of you that once did has gone quiet, and now action feels pointless. Because the why behind the action has dissolved, meaning that's the missing piece. And without it, even movement becomes mourning. So if you're stuck right now, not knowing why you can't begin, maybe it's because a part of you already said goodbye, not to the dream, but to the version of you who believed it was possible. And that grief, it doesn't look like crying. It looks like scrolling, numbing, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for something to feel real again. You're not lazy, you're in mourning, and your silence isn't apathy. It's the quiet sound of someone searching for a reason to begin again. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. There's a voice inside your paralysis, but it doesn't scream. It whispers, like an old guardian afraid you'll step into a fire you don't remember walking through the first time, and so you stop. Not because you're lazy, but because something in you is trying to protect something else in you, a wound, a memory, an identity you're still too afraid to let go of. We call it procrastination, but it's a character, a version of you that once learned, if I stay still, I won't get hurt again. You never questioned what it was trying to protect, you just called it failure. But what if you gave it a name, gave it a voice? What would it say? If I do this and fail, I'll lose what little belief I still have in myself. If I do this and it works, I'll have no excuse for the emptiness that follows. If I do this, I'll have to confront the silence that success can't fix. There's always something beneath the fear, always someone inside the hesitation. And when you dare to ask what that part of you is trying to prevent, you might find it's not failure, it fears. It's the truth that effort won't save you from the question, who am I if this doesn't make me feel whole? Now imagine a mirror, but there's no reflection, just space, no image to maintain, no mask to adjust, just the silence of being without proof, without performance. What do you see when there's nothing left to validate you? That's where freedom begins. Not in achieving more, but in no longer needing achievement to justify your existence. The paralysis is a gate, not a wall, and if you walk through it, not to conquer, but to understand, you may finally meet the self who's been waiting for you beneath all the trying. There's a violence in your stillness, but it's not coming from the outside. It's something internal, something you've turned against yourself. Because when you look closely, what you call laziness doesn't feel soft. It doesn't feel like rest. It feels like exile, like being trapped in a room where every second whispers you don't deserve to move. You think you're resting, but you're not. You're punishing. You're punishing yourself for the things you never said, for the dreams you couldn't protect, for the ways you betrayed your own hunger just to be accepted. There's rage in there, but it's muted, redirected, not out into the world, but inward, into your joints, your muscles, your motivation. Because if you don't believe you deserve anything, then doing nothing becomes justice. You fail on purpose because success would be a betrayal of the identity you built from pain. And sometimes that pain isn't even yours. It was handed to you, in words that told you to shrink, in silence that taught you your needs were too much, in the eyes of someone who looked at you and didn't see you at all. So you took that shame, made it yours, and now you wear it like a chain, calling it laziness, when it's really self-imposed exile. What if this inertia isn't about apathy? What if it's self-harm, the silent kind, where no one sees the wounds because they don't bleed? They just echo. And what if the person you're punishing never actually did anything wrong? What if the guilt you carry was someone else's weight, someone else's blindness, someone else's inability to love you the way you needed? You are not broken. You are grieving. Grieving a self that learned to disappear in order to be safe. And now, perhaps for the first time, that self is asking to be seen, not judged, not fixed, just seen. Laziness is the word we give to the invisible, to the weight that doesn't show up on scales, to the collapse that happens without a sound. You've been calling it a flaw, but it's not the absence of energy. It's the absence of meaning. You wake up with tasks, with goals, with lists. But no matter how much you cross off, the ache remains, because the ache was never about what you weren't doing. It was about what you weren't allowed to feel. The truth is, you haven't been living. You've been managing yourself, like a machine that malfunctions in private, but smiles on cue. And when that machine pauses, when it refuses to perform, you don't ask why. You blame it. You shame it. You call it lazy. But beneath that pause is exile. The quiet place where all the abandoned parts of you are kept. The ambition you shut down because it scared others. The softness you silenced because it wasn't safe. The voice you stopped using because no one listened. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's the real tragedy. Not that you're stuck, but that you think it's just who you are. You're not failing. You're imploding, slowly, quietly, under the pressure of being someone you were never meant to be. And maybe now it's not about fixing yourself, not about productivity or schedules. Maybe now it's about standing in the ruins of who you pretended to be, and finally just feeling what's real, not to escape it, but to meet yourself there, without noise, without fixing, without shame. You're not alone. And yes, it's still not too late.